We're counting down the 20 most iconic Black musicians of the 1970s who didn't just make history with their sound, they risked everything behind the scenes. From game-changing contract showdowns and assassination attempts to stage-crafting magicians and headline-grabbing censorship, these artists faced industry battles, political violence, mental health struggles, and the fight for creative control. Some redefined genres, others survived tragedies, but all shaped the decade's legacy. Which story kicks off the countdown, and how did a nightclub rejection spark a musical revolution? Let's start with number 20. On New Year's Eve, 1977, Nile Rodgers and Bernard Edwards of Chic stood outside Studio 54, invitation in hand, only to be denied at the door. The doorman bluntly told them to f off, and they went back to Nile's apartment, frustrated and ready to vent. That night, they turned rejection into rhythm, jamming out a riff with a chorus that started as pure spite. The hook was too raw for radio. With a quick rewrite, the off became freak out, and La Freak was born. Released in late 1978, the single shot to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 3 separate times, holding the top spot for a total of 3 weeks and becoming one of disco's defining anthems. Chic's momentum did not stop there. In 1979, they released Good Times, a groove so infectious that the Sugar Hill Gang built Rapper's Delight around its bass line. After some legal wrangling, Rodgers and Edwards were credited as co-writers, tying the birth of commercial hip-hop directly to a disco-fueled snub at the club door. Grace Jones arrived in New York's nightlife just as disco was reaching its fever pitch. She wasn't just a regular at Studio 54, she was part of the club's visual language, striding in with sculpted cheekbones, tailored suits, and a presence that blurred the line between model and performance artist. Her partnership with Jean-Paul Goude, the French-Haitian image maker, pushed that even further. Goude's lens turned Jones into a living sculpture, with flat-top hair, geometric makeup, and impossible poses that made every album cover and magazine spread feel like a manifesto. In 1977, Jones released her debut album, Portfolio, on Island Records. It included a 7-minute reimagining of La Vie en Rose, where her voice glided over a slow disco groove, stretching the song into something hypnotic and new. That track became her calling card in clubs from Manhattan to Paris. While her chart success in the United States was modest, her influence was anything but. She set the template for avant-garde Black pop, opening doors for artists who wanted to experiment with gender, fashion, and sound all at once. Barry White's story begins in the tough streets of South Central Los Angeles. At 16, he was arrested for stealing Cadillac tires and sent to juvenile detention for 4 months. It was there, inside a concrete cell, that he first heard Elvis Presley's "It's Now or Never" on the radio. That moment changed his life. White later said that hearing Elvis's voice made him realize he wanted to make music, not trouble. Less than a decade later, he was leading the Love Unlimited Orchestra, blending lush strings and pounding rhythms into a new kind of soul. In early 1974, their instrumental track, Love's Theme, soared to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, making history as one of the first orchestral disco hits to top the pop charts. White's journey from jailhouse epiphany to chart-topping arranger showed that redemption could sound as rich and sweeping as the music he brought to dance floors everywhere. By 1970, Nina Simone had vanished from the American stage. She left the country, settling first in Barbados, then drifting through Liberia, Switzerland, and France. The move was about more than geography. Simone was fleeing the Internal Revenue Service and the relentless pressure of American racism, a toll that had followed her since the civil rights marches of the 1960s. She spoke openly about feeling hounded by the government and by the music industry that often failed to pay her what she was owed. In exile, Simone's reputation for volatility only grew. She demanded absolute respect from her audiences and when she felt it was not given, she did not hesitate to act. At the Montreux Jazz Festival in 1976, she famously stopped mid-song, glared at the crowd, and walked off stage, leaving stunned silence in her wake. Incidents like these were not just about temperament. They reflected years of financial strain, mental health struggles, and a refusal to compromise her principles. Simone's battles with the world outside became battles on stage, where every performance was a test of loyalty, both from herself and from those watching. Isaac Hayes stepped onto the Hollywood stage in 1972 and changed the rules overnight. When the Academy called his name for Best Original Song, honoring theme from Shaft, he became the first Black composer to win an Oscar in that category. Hayes did not just collect awards, he built a new image for soul musicians in the process. His look was unmistakable: a floor-length vest made from shimmering gold chains, bare chest, sunglasses, and the air of someone who knew exactly what he was worth. The press called him Black Moses, a persona he wore in album art and on stage, radiating confidence and authority. His Oscar win sent a message to Hollywood and the music industry: Black artists could not only headline soundtracks, they could own the spotlight. His success with Shaft opened doors for other musicians to cross into film and take control of their creative legacies, setting the stage for the kind of soundtrack power Curtis Mayfield would soon wield. Hayes' gold-draped bravado was not just style, it was a statement of arrival. Betty Davis set out to shake every expectation, on stage and off. When she married Miles Davis in 1968, she pulled him into the world of Jimi Hendrix and Sly Stone, opening his ears to the psychedelic edge that would fuel his electric jazz revolution. Betty's own music in the early 1970s was just as radical. Her albums fused raw funk with lyrics and performances that were unapologetically sexual, years before mainstream pop would even flirt with that kind of honesty. But that same boldness came at a price. As her live shows grew more provocative, local NAACP chapters and Black community leaders began to push back. Some called her performances a disgrace, and the pressure led promoters to cancel her gigs mid-tour. Even with critical praise and a cult following, Betty found doors closing in places where she expected support. Her career stalled, not because the music industry was not ready, but because parts of her own community were not willing to let a Black woman claim that kind of freedom on her own terms. In 1974, Rufus was already a tight Chicago funk band, but everything changed when Stevie Wonder dropped by a session and heard Chaka Khan's voice. He wrote "Tell Me Something Good" just for her, handing the band a song that would rocket them into the spotlight. The track reached the top 5 on the Billboard Hot 100, and it won Rufus their first Grammy, selling over 1 million copies. That was a breakthrough by any standard. But with the spotlight came a shift in the band's center of gravity. Media and fans zeroed in on Chaka's powerhouse vocals and magnetic stage presence, leaving the rest of Rufus in her shadow. The chemistry that made the band work now fueled creative tension, as interviews and press clippings focused more on Chaka than on the group as a whole. By the end of the year, the label and promoters insisted on a new billing, Rufus featuring Chaka Khan. That single line on the marquee said it all. Her voice was now the brand, and the group's identity would never be the same. Earth, Wind & Fire did not just play concerts, they engineered spectacles. Maurice White wanted every arena show to feel like a ritual, so he brought in an Egyptologist to help design the band's signature pyramid motifs and ancient symbols. It was not just about visuals. To make the impossible happen on stage, White hired Doug Henning, the era's most famous magician. Henning's illusions turned live performances into full-blown magic acts. Drum kits levitated, musicians vanished in clouds of smoke, and pyramids seemed to pulse with light. These shows were not just for show, they were a business move too. Ticket sales soared, and by the end of the 1970s, Earth, Wind & Fire's total album sales had climbed past 20 million worldwide. Their blend of Afrofuturist imagery, mysticism, and arena-scale production set a new bar for what Black music could look like on the biggest stages, proving that disciplined spectacle could be both culturally rich and wildly profitable. In 1971, Gil Scott-Heron released a track that would echo for generations: "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." Its spoken word delivery, set against a pulsing jazz-funk backdrop, broke from tradition. Gil Scott-Heron's voice did not sing, it declared, riffing on headlines, slogans, and the language of protest. Critics and scholars now trace the roots of hip-hop lyricism and political edge back to that recording, with artists from Public Enemy to Mos Def citing Gil Scott-Heron as a blueprint. The influence was not limited to records. In the mid-1970s, he stepped away from the commercial spotlight and took up a faculty post at Federal City College in Washington, D.C. There he taught creative writing and media, treating the classroom as another stage for activism. College records from the mid-1970s list him as a faculty member, and students recall workshops that blurred the lines between poetry, journalism, and social critique. Gil Scott-Heron's legacy is built not just on what he performed, but on what he taught, laying the groundwork for a new generation of politically engaged, rhythm-driven artists. In 1975, Donna Summer's "Love to Love You Baby" hit the airwaves with a sound that was impossible to ignore. Breathy moans stretched across 17 minutes, pushing disco into uncharted territory. The BBC quickly clamped down, banning the single from several radio stations for being too sexually explicit. Time magazine counted 22 simulated orgasms on the track, a detail that only fueled its notoriety. But controversy did not slow Summer down. By 1978, she was rewriting the rules of commercial success. Her run of 3 consecutive double albums, Once Upon a Time, Live and More, and Bad Girls, all soared to #1 on the Billboard charts, a feat no other artist had pulled off before. Summer's music sold millions, but it also forced a public conversation about the boundaries of pop, the policing of Black female sexuality, and who got to define the sound of a generation. Every band and headline only seemed to make her disco reign more unstoppable. In 1971, while Ain't No Sunshine climbed the charts, Bill Withers was still punching a time clock on the Boeing assembly line in California, fitting toilets into Boeing 747s. He was 32 when his debut album, Just As I Am, finally landed, a late start by music business standards. The album cover says it all. Withers stands in work clothes holding a lunch pail, refusing to dress up his story for anyone. He kept that factory job even as his single went gold, saying he did not trust the industry to last. Sussex Records tried to nudge him into the spotlight, but Withers moved at his own pace, writing songs that sounded like lived-in advice from a neighbor. His skepticism about fame became part of his appeal. No spectacle, no persona, just a catalog of songs that outlasted every trend, proving that ordinary life could fuel extraordinary music. Aretha Franklin stepped into the New Temple Missionary Baptist Church in Los Angeles in January 1972, surrounded by a congregation that felt more like family than fans. Over 2 nights, she recorded Amazing Grace live, channeling the power of gospel straight from the sanctuary to vinyl. The album captured not just her voice, but the energy of a packed church, shouts, applause, and the unmistakable call and response of Black worship. When Amazing Grace hit stores later that year, it shattered expectations for what gospel could do in the pop era. The record sold over 2 million copies in the United States alone, making it the best-selling gospel album ever released at that time. Aretha's embrace of her roots wasn't just about nostalgia or image. She spoke openly about what it meant to be called the Queen of Soul, saying it was less about a title and more about serving her community, lifting people up through music that felt like home. In a decade defined by reinvention and risk, Aretha's gospel comeback crowned her not just as a vocalist, but as a leader whose power was measured in unity and spirit. Sly Stone spent 1970 on the road, but chaos followed him everywhere. Promoters booked 80 shows that year. Sly missed 26. Fans waited hours in packed venues, sometimes only to hear the announcement that the Family Stone would not appear at all. The music press started tracking his absences like box scores, and rumors about drug use and paranoia spread fast. The missed gigs were not just about unreliable behavior. They drained trust from the band, strained relationships with managers, and left promoters scrambling to fill empty stages. In the studio, Sly's world grew even darker. By 1971, he locked himself away with drum machines and tape loops, layering tracks late into the night. The result was There's a Riot Going On, an album so murky and claustrophobic it sounded like the 1960s dream collapsing in real time. Gone was the bright optimism of everyday people. In its place, a soundtrack of isolation, exhaustion, and self-destruction, a warning about what fame and addiction can do when the spotlight will not let you hide. Donny Hathaway's voice could fill a room with hope, but behind the scenes, his world was closing in. Diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, Hathaway spent much of the 1970s battling hallucinations and deep suspicion, sometimes convinced that those closest to him wanted to harm him. Friends and collaborators, including Roberta Flack, watched as his symptoms grew harder to manage. Studio sessions were interrupted by sudden outbursts, and tours became nearly impossible to sustain. On January 13, 1979, Hathaway fell from the 15th floor of Manhattan's Essex House Hotel. Police ruled his death a suicide. He was just 33 years old. Roberta Flack later described being shattered by the news, shelving their planned duets and retreating from the spotlight for weeks. Hathaway's loss sent shockwaves through the music world and forced a reckoning with the silence around mental health in Black communities, a silence that still lingers today. His story remains a heartbreaking reminder of the cost of neglect and the urgent need for care. George Clinton's vision for Parliament Funkadelic was never small. By 1976, he was leading a musical collective that blurred the lines between band, circus, and science fiction theater. Clinton wanted every show to feel like an arrival from another dimension, so he commissioned the Mothership, a spaceship stage prop that cost around $275,000 to build. That is the equivalent of well over $1 million today. The Mothership did not just descend from the rafters. It landed on the imaginations of an entire generation, making P-Funk concerts legendary for their spectacle. But that spectacle came at a steep price. The tour's massive production costs swallowed up profits, and Clinton later admitted that after paying for the spaceship, costumes, and effects, there was little money left for anyone else. Behind the scenes, the business side of P-Funk was tangled in fraud. Parliament Funkadelic ran as a sprawling collective with dozens of musicians, rotating lineups, and a patchwork of contracts across multiple labels. That made tracking royalties a nightmare. Musicians who played on hit records often found themselves left out of royalty payments or even uncredited. Court filings and interviews from the late 1970s and the 1980s show a steady stream of lawsuits over unpaid money, missing credits, and disputed master ownership. Clinton himself spent years battling labels and former managers over who controlled the rights to the band's biggest songs. By the time outside companies like Bridgeport Music took control of much of the P-Funk publishing, the catalog had become one of the most litigated in popular music. The Mothership's dazzling arrival masked a business structure that left many of its creators fighting for scraps, turning what looked like a funk utopia into a cautionary tale about ambition, spectacle, and the cost of not owning your own house. Curtis Mayfield didn't just write the soundtrack for a movement, He built the business behind it. In Chicago, he and Eddie Thomas incorporated Curtom Records, making Mayfield one of the first major soul stars to own his own label. That meant he controlled what music got released, who produced it, and crucially, who got paid. While most artists signed away their masters and publishing, Mayfield kept a grip on both, setting a new standard for Black economic independence in music. The breakthrough came in 1972 when Mayfield wrote and produced the soundtrack for the film Superfly. The movie was a hit in the emerging blaxploitation wave, but the music became its own phenomenon. According to industry estimates and Billboard reports, the Superfly soundtrack pulled in about $5 million in its first 2 months, outgrossing the film itself. That kind of windfall was almost unheard of for a Black-owned label in the early 1970s, especially one run by the artist whose name was on the cover. But Mayfield didn't use Curtom just to enrich himself. He signed and developed Chicago talent, used his platform to release politically charged records, and funneled profits back into his community. The success of Superfly wasn't just a personal triumph. It was proof that Black artists could run the show from the boardroom to the studio. In an era when most labels kept tight control over their stars, Mayfield's model at Curtom showed a different path. Own your sound, own your message, and keep the rewards where they belong. In Lagos 1970, Fela Kuti drew a line in the sand. He renamed his communal compound the Kalakuta Republic, declaring it a space beyond the reach of Nigeria's military regime. Kalakuta became more than a home. It was a recording studio, a sanctuary for his band, family, and followers, and a nerve center for Afrobeat's rise. Fela's defiance was not just musical. His 1976 song Zombie ridiculed the army, calling soldiers mindless robots. The record exploded across Nigeria, infuriating those in power. Retaliation came swiftly. On February 18, 1977, eyewitnesses and family accounts describe hundreds, possibly close to 1,000, Nigerian soldiers sealing off the neighborhood. They stormed Kalakuta, battering down fences and bursting through doors. Inside, chaos reigned. Fela was beaten severely, his skull fractured. Residents, including women and children, were brutalized. The soldiers torched the compound, burning down the studio, master tapes, instruments, and a free clinic run by Fela's brother, Dr. Beko Ransom Kuti. The violence reached its most devastating point when Fela's mother, Funmilayo Ransom Kuti, was thrown from a second-story window. She never recovered from her injuries and died the following year. The government's official inquiry blamed an unknown soldier, refusing responsibility. Fela responded in kind. He delivered his mother's coffin to the army barracks in protest and recorded albums like Coffin for Head of State and Unknown Soldier, naming names and refusing silence. The Kalakuta raid stands as one of the most brutal crackdowns on a musician in modern history, transforming Fela's music into a permanent indictment of state violence. On December 3, 1976, 7 gunmen stormed Bob Marley's home at 56 Hope Road in Kingston while the band rehearsed for the Smile Jamaica concert. Bullets struck Marley in the chest and arm. His wife Rita was shot in the head, and his manager Don Taylor took wounds to his legs and torso. Despite the attack, Marley took the stage 2 days later, still bandaged, performing for a crowd desperate for calm in a country torn by political violence. The concert, meant as a peace gesture, had become a flashpoint in Jamaica's fierce battle between the People's National Party and the Jamaica Labour Party. Rumors swirled about who ordered the hit. Some pointed at political gangs. Others whispered about foreign hands. No one was ever brought to trial. After the show, Marley left Jamaica for London, carrying scars and a sense of exile. There he recorded Exodus, an album that would define his legacy. Released in 1977, Exodus was more than music. It was a message of survival and unity. forged in the shadow of gunfire. The album's impact stretched far beyond the Caribbean. In the United Kingdom, it stayed on the charts for 56 straight weeks, turning Marley from a reggae star into a global symbol of resistance. Time magazine later named it Album of the Century. The bullets in Kingston did not silence him, they amplified his voice, sending reggae's call for justice and peace around the world. Marvin Gaye's 1970s were shaped by battles that went far beyond the studio. In 1971, he brought Motown to a standstill when he refused to record anything except What's Going On. Berry Gordy, the label's founder, reportedly called the track the worst thing I ever heard in my life. Gaye stood his ground, a stand that paid off, and when the single finally dropped, it proved Gordy wrong, selling millions and laying the foundation for a new kind of soul music that spoke directly to protest and pain. But the fight for creative freedom came with a price. As Marvin's star rose, so did his financial troubles. By the late 1970s, the IRS was closing in with tax liens, and his personal life was unraveling. The most public blow came in 1977 when a Los Angeles court ordered him to pay a large part of his next album's royalties to his ex-wife Anna Gordy Gaye as part of their divorce settlement. Instead of hiding from the mess, Marvin poured it all into the music. The result was the album Here My Dear, an album so raw it read like a diary, with lyrics tracing every twist of the breakup and the court case. Released in 1978, the record was more than just catharsis. It was court-mandated art, shaped by legal and financial binds that most artists would never dare to put on wax. Marvin Gaye's story in the 1970s is proof that sometimes the greatest music is forged in the fire of crisis, where contracts, debts, and heartbreak all bleed into the grooves. At just 21, Stevie Wonder made a move that would change the rules for Black artists everywhere. On May 13, 1971, he let his childhood Motown contract expire. He had signed that deal as Little Stevie Wonder when he was still a minor. Rather than scramble for a new label, he recorded independently in New York and built leverage that Motown could not ignore. By 1975, the industry was buzzing about his new deal. Press reports called it the biggest in music history, a 7-year agreement worth $13 million that gave Stevie full creative control, a higher royalty rate, and the rights to his own publishing. That level of autonomy was almost unheard of, especially for a Black artist at a major label. But Stevie's story was not just about contracts and headlines. On August 6, 1973, everything nearly ended on a North Carolina highway. A logging truck's load crashed onto the car Stevie was riding in, leaving him in a coma for 4 days. Family and friends kept vigil at his bedside, unsure if he would ever wake up. When he finally regained consciousness, he had lost his sense of smell, a change he later described as permanent. Yet, within months, he was back in the studio, pouring everything into his music. That return was a testament to his resilience. The results were historic. Between 1974 and 1977, Stevie Wonder won 3 Album of the Year Grammys for Intervisions, Fulfilling This First Finale, and Songs in the Key of Life, a run almost no one else has matched. Over the course of the decade, he took home 14 Grammys, redefining what creative freedom could accomplish. Stevie Wonder's 1970s were not just about surviving. They were about setting the standard for artistic power, resilience, and the right to own your own sound. Across all 20 stories, one pattern stands out. True innovation in Black music came from battling systems built to limit both creativity and portrayals. These musicians navigated censorship, exploitation, and real danger, not just to make hits, but to claim ownership of their art and their identities. That fight reshaped global music, and it still fuels today's struggles for creative freedom. Their legacy is not just sound, it is resistance. Which story challenged your view of the 1970s? Drop your thoughts below.